Hi there. Welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast. In this special highlights episode of the Inner Game of Change, we revisit some of the most impactful moments from our top episodes. While every conversation this year has been rich with invaluable insights, these highlights showcase standout lessons and perspectives that have resonated deeply with our audience. Join me as we explore the key themes in leadership, change, and transformation. From episode 76. In this episode, Carol Sanford sheds light on the nuanced dynamics of change and leadership development. She emphasizes that while change can start quickly, it takes time to deepen and truly transform organizations in a sustainable way. Drawing from her experiences, Carol shares how focusing on education and development, particularly the ability to think critically and self-manage, can replace traditional top-down approaches. By empowering teams to be self-directed and embracing long-term strategies, organizations can achieve deeper and more meaningful and impactful transformations. I want to ask you, Carol, you mentioned something around allowing change to happen over a period of time. We come across organizations that just want things to happen in a few months. And somebody like you and myself, I always know that change needs time to happen. So you did talk about your 3 to 5 to 8 years.
Yeah.
The principle of time when it comes to implementing change and transforming an organization, how critical is that to embed change and see the results?
So I don't think change takes real long. I think to deepen it takes a long time. But like in South Africa, Colgate, we were there when Mandela came over Robben Island and became the president of the country. They mandated that the top of a company had to reflect the racial mix of the country, and it was mandated to happen within 5 years. People swore that there would be violence, and there was in most companies. In Colgate, we within 6 months reached that goal, where we had 95% Black Africans, where they'd been 95% white, and none of it was with a program to go after that directly. We educated people on how to run a company, and we were meeting very intensely. Every detail, well, not every, a lot of the details in my most recent book. We didn't tell anyone they had to change. We said, say-so to the general managers, and I want to build a great country while we build a great company. So if you start with something bigger, which includes everyone, everybody wants to play. And we did it all with education, none with restructuring. If we've done that with every place we work, and within 6 months, major changes happen, but it won't get deep and permanent in 6 months. So every place, like even with Crown Saddleback years ago, one of my earliest clients, we took them in 1 year from let's see, what were they at? 24th out of 25 in their industry in revenue. So I think that when we say it takes a long time, people have the image, nothing happens, nothing, instead of it's building. So 3 to 5 years is a steady, or 3 to 8, I think it is. Harvard did a study, which I cite in several of my books, that it's like a layering. And if you know how to do it, a lot happens early and you have momentum. And then you layer. I have 6 phases, which are not explainable in a short podcast, but they work as layers to bring about change. And so there's one real disruptive opening that builds a shift in how you learn. And then there's a next shock to the system that builds a different way of making decisions. And then one that changes how they work with customers. And so it's not a long time to do application. Every phase is applied immediately, not application taking 8 years. The phases are introduced and applied, introduced and applied. So it's a very layered process.
Carol, I'd like you to educate me if I get this wrong. What you're saying is that change will always happen very quickly at the service level, but time only when you want to go deeper, which is the most important piece. And when you say, yeah.
The most important is nothing later. It's all at the beginning. I don't think about time at all.
Sure.
I don't think it's relevant. I think if you know how to educate people, you go faster than if you try and do what you're talking about, which is bring about change by restructuring and changing how people work. That will slow you down if you instead educate people and work on something huge, which is really important, something too big to do alone. It's all very fast. Nothing I've done is slow. I think the whole idea that it takes a long time and there are some things you have to build toward. The first things I do are quite disruptive. And once people are unstuck, you can be in education, but stop all the restructuring. That will kill the speed.
Can you please help me understand when you focus a lot on the word educating the business? Yeah. What does that mean like if I want to explain that to my client or if I want to apply it in my practice? What does that look like, Carol?
So the word I should be using in that instance is development. We start with developing people's capacity for managing their thinking and being able to observe what their sourcing is, what their reactivity is, how to see what's going on and the effects. And so education is a lot about inner processing, which we were stopped doing with behaviorism, where they did only external behavior management. So we go back to you have to believe that people can grow and change, not by incentives, but by self-direction. So the entire process is building a self-managing, self-determining, self-directed workforce where every individual can see the whole. And so we start with, in every case, using it in an applied way. So people come into sessions in natural work teams, not as individuals, and they go apply what we are doing with them immediately. We don't teach them what to do. We teach them how to think about it. And then they make choices and have other evaluation frameworks where they get better and better at thinking for themselves, and we're slowly moving away from traditional structures like top-down management, functional groups, supervisors, and delegation. In my third book, The Regenerative Business, There are 30 toxic practices, so we're slowly moving away from those and having people substitute their own design based on certain different kind of principles, not based on behaviorism, but based on self-determining capacity in humans. So that's what I mean by education. They're learning to think differently, but they're not learning what we think they should do, only how they get better and better at thinking.
From episode 71, Dr. David Weiss shares how focusing on bystanders, not resistors, can build the momentum for change. He introduces the 5 stories of change, a framework for effective communication, and explains the importance of diagnosing resistance, whether personal, cultural, or principled, to address it strategically. You focus a lot in the article on the bystanders. Do you want to double click on that, please?
Well, so the proposition is that the champion, the one who's going to be passionately for your change, they believe in it, they're going to probably be vocal about support, and they will be out there saying it to others. If you think about what a resistor is, they tend to be vocal, but instead of being positive towards your change, they're negative. So the proposition is that a resistor really is a champion for the other side. They don't call themselves resistors. They call themselves champions for the other side. If you think about an election, it's the people who are advocates for your opponent. And the probability of changing the mind of a resistor or someone who's a advocate for the other side is probably equal to the probability of changing the mind of a champion. So what are we doing? We work and spend all this time thinking about the resistors and trying to change their mind, but the probability of succeeding is exceedingly low. It's not impossible. It could be very beneficial if you succeeded it, but it's probably low. I kind of think of it like penny stocks. If I got one that made a lot of money, that's great. But the reality is it's unlikely. So where should you be focusing your attention? And usually the majority of people in any significant change haven't really taken a position. They sit on the fence. I call them bystanders. And what I mean by a bystander is they're waiting and seeing. And who's actually talking to the bystander? Well, usually it's the resistors who are talking to them and saying, this is why you should join my side and actually resist a little bit more. And you as the leader are spending all your time trying to convince the resistor, who is basically immovable because they're the champions for the other side. So you leave the field totally open to influence the bystanders. And the proposition is, and a very important one of the principles, is focus on the bystanders as your priority. If they are representing over 50% of a population in any significant change, they're the wait and see people, then you need to actually talk to them, share with them, honor their past, share the why of what's needed, share, what you're doing and why you think it's a better fit, engage them so that they feel a part of the change. And by virtue of doing that, you might win over half of them to say, you know what, I'll help. I'll go along. I won't be your champion, but I'll help. And the other half will say, I'll still be a bystander, but you will not be in a position where you'll have so many joining the resistor because no one was talking to them. So focus on the bystanders, probably a major insight that a lot of people miss when they think about resistance. It's like the teacher who teaches the class and focuses on the 2 students who are making the most noise in the class. And the parents come to the teacher and say, there are 30 kids in this class. What about the other 28? Aren't you teaching them as well? You're focusing on just the 2 noisy ones. And that's a mistake that leaders make frequently. And in fact, I talk to executives. They make it at the very top of the organization. They worry about the noisiest person. They're the hardest ones to change. And they don't spend enough time on those bystanders who are really going to make the difference in building the critical mass to support the change.
David, I want to ask you a question. How can somebody become a bystander? Is that because the messages are not clear? Is that because they don't understand the particulars of the change? Is that because we've got a tendency to wait and see and which direction the change will happen? Maybe is there a tendency for the bystanders to listen to the resistors first and see, because the resistors usually create the story? Why would I become a bystander? Why would I not choose a stance early?
It's our political undecided vote. Why are people undecided? Why do people not make a choice? We know in marketing that there are many people who are those who wait and see. There are early adopts, there are late adopts, and people don't necessarily trust. They don't necessarily jump immediately. But remember, the bystanders are not resisting. The bystanders are just watching. They're checking it out. They're trying to see what is happening. So it's very common. In fact, a lot of people who end up becoming helpers, they end up, originally starting as bystanders. It's not a bad thing, the bystanders. The bystanders are a normal reaction to see what's the implications. And some of the implications that people are thinking about is this going to hurt me? Is it not going to hurt me? I don't know yet. I'll wait and see. Do I trust you? Do I not trust you? I'm not sure. I'm going to wait and see. Do I really understand it? Like, what is the change? Why are we changing? Why are you messing up everything? I don't really get it. So I don't get it until I understand it. Then ultimately I'll be a bystander. That's why I propose that you use what I call the 5 stories of change and focus them especially on bystanders. Story number 1 is honor the past, which I referred to earlier. Story number 2 is understand the new why, the new context, what's really going on that actually necessitates a potentially different response. Story number 3 is what is deficient about the current way we are doing things that doesn't fit the new context. Story number 4 is what are we proposing that ultimately is a better fit? And at the same time, what are we not changing? That often is very important for the bystander because they'll exaggerate and they'll say, oh, it's bigger than I thought it was, but narrow it to what really is changing. And story number 5 is how can the bystander actually put their fingerprints and contribute to the change? And by virtue of being part of the change, people start saying, you know what, I'll help out the process. People don't mind change. They mind being changed. If we can change the dynamic so that people feel that they're meaningfully contributing to the change, then it creates an environment where more than likely they'll say, I'll give it a try. And that's all you really want from the bystander. You want them to move up one notch, not to be the champions, although that'd be wonderful, but at least to say, I'll be a helper. I'll actually go along when you ask me to do it, and I'll participate in it, and certainly won't resist. So the bystanders are crucial, and it's a very normal reaction. It's not that, it's not anything other than people not understanding they need the leader to focus on them so that they can journey with you on this change process.
And this is how I read in your article. This is the best way to create and focus on the critical mass.
So I want you to also, once you focus on the bystanders, have individual conversations with the key resistors to find out why are they resisting. People whitewash the resistor and say all resistance is alike, but that's not correct. Resistance could differ. For example, someone might be resistant because they disagree with you. I call that principled resistance. And principled resistance means that, I don't agree that there's a compelling reason to change. I don't agree that your choice of what to do is the correct thing. And maybe in conversation, they'll understand some variables that might make them realize, oh, I didn't know that. Thanks for sharing that. Now I can support you. The other one is cultural resistance, probably the toughest to move, where I don't trust you. And trust, when you fall out of trust, takes forever to build, and it's very, very difficult to reconstruct trust. So if they don't trust you or trust the organization, they have bad experiences with change. They thought you said before that things won't hurt anybody, but it did. They're not going to easily trust you again. Find out if that's the compelling reason. That's going to be a very tough group to change. And then often the largest group of resistors are the ones where they understand it, they even trust you, but in the end they feel that it's not good for me. I have to learn something new I don't want to learn. It changes my job. I lose my job. Whatever the case is, it's going to hurt me. What's in it for me? The WIFM, as we call it, WIFM. Mm-hmm. What's in it for me? And those people, you can talk to them. It's going to be tough to change if you can't accommodate them, but maybe you can accommodate them. Maybe the resistance is, this is a really tough time in my life. I'm having a child. My mother is sick. Now I've got just too much going on. I can't handle another change at this moment. Is there a way to accommodate that timing variable? And there may be, if you understand it. So talk to that resistor, find out whether it's personal, whether it's cultural, whether it's principled, and through that process, see if you can work something out that might get them to move. That could be very, very beneficial. But the number one focus needs to be on the bystand. That's the secondary choice, to go back to the resistor and see if you can make any movement.
From episode 75, Jess Tile dives into the barriers that keep leaders stuck in the high-performance stage and highlights what it takes to advance toward mastery. She unpacks the critical mindset shifts and organizational factors that influence this journey. Jess also explores the continuum of leadership mastery, focusing on the importance of reflection, holistic thinking, and redefining success as leaders evolve. I would like you just to double click on the idea that once we get to, if all things are in the right place, we plateau at the higher achiever. Can you go deeper into that? What could be some of the things that will get us into that stage where we no longer would like to go further than that?
That's a very good question. And there's a few things. The first is the notion of the enemy of great is good enough. So once we see that this is good enough, why go further? Then why go further? Stay there. So basically, that's kind of our comfort zone. And this is kind of emphasized, or something that is making this stagnation real, is the achievement. How do we measure achievement? What does success look like? If success looks like doing more of the same, keep delivering programs, projects, there is that limited definition of what success looks like. It's not holistic enough. It's not getting to the people element of things. Then that kind of, puts us in that box of like, yeah, that's good enough. I'm still here, which begs the another element into the equation. If what does the organization see as the distinction between high performers and the need for having somebody at a higher level of mastery, which is the orchestrator and master. If there is no need in the collective leadership team and the organization don't see the need for that, we're doing fine as it is. And that term, we've always done it that way. Then again, why would there be an incentive for the leader to go and seek opportunities for personal development, for growth, if they are not going to be rewarded for it and there is no quote unquote return on investment?
So what I hear you say is that things like incentive programs, performance measures, you're not saying a high achiever is a high performer is a bad position to be in.
No.
It's if somebody's already ticking the boxes and they're getting their bonuses and their teams are really performing, and if the organization, as you said, they're happy where they are, kicking goals, that's probably a good state to be in. However, you and I know in a dynamic marketplace, staying in there can only take you to, to a place. But because of the dynamics of the market, you're always threatened, and highly likely you will go backward if you've got a new product, a new service, or as a leader, you move organizations, because by default, sometimes you can move from being a high achiever, start somewhere else as a performer. Any thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I'll give you one example. If an organization considers what success looks like is deliver on time, on budget, on scope, then what you measure is what people give you. Then they're going to give you on time, on budget, on scope. But if the success changes to change adoption, that's a very different ballgame altogether.
Yeah.
And that's when the leader starts to realize, maybe I don't know how to actually do this. I need more, not just more in terms of more in the toolkit and some few tools. The mindset needs to change. The way I influence needs to change. The way I speak, the words, the language, the narrative needs to change. That's what starts to move them from the high performer to becoming an orchestrator, because now basically you're going deeper because you're trying to create a change that is going to be adopted, which is not fully in your control. To enable people to see differently, relate differently, feel differently about something is a skill in itself. And in saying that, when the success measures don't change in an organization, is this traditional of cascading a strategy from top to bottom. You've got a portfolio of projects. You're looking after this. Make that happen for me. And then, as you know, we've had many redundancies. The job market is becoming more and more uncertain. And then they go, look for another job. Either they've made redundant or contract ended, or basically they're just, they want to move. Without having that level of mastery, you can't really stand out. You are compared on the basis of two things: the package, the salary, and past achievements. And if you're willing to go a little bit less and maybe reduce your responsibilities or do the same thing but in another organization, then that's that. And I also want to mention something that there's nothing wrong with being a high achiever or a high performer. We do need that for sure. There's nothing wrong. It's not a bad, good situation. However, we know that change is constant. We know that. It's getting more and more complex. The landscape where we need to implement the change and transformation is getting more and more complex. The pace of change has accelerated. More and more things are coming into either technology or new ways of thinking, new ways of working, all of that. It will draw some of the high performers to what is next for me, because they'll start to feel the ceiling. This can't be just it. And that's not for everyone, because it requires you to put yourself out there. It requires you to be vulnerable. It requires you to be able to, or have that ability to let go of old ways of thinking and replace them with new ways of thinking, and bring that beginner's mindset for you to be able to observe something different.
I want to shift gear and I want to ask you about, can this model apply to the change management practice roles? We started usually a performer, and then through sheer experience, dedication, personal development, we kind of progress. I don't think we will ever get to a mastery, because things always change. And that's probably a good place to be, not to be in a mastery. Can you see the parallels in there? Or actually at a higher level, can I even apply this model that you've got in a transformation journey to any role, really?
Conceptually, it applies to every role that there is. If we want to apply the role in a more practical implementation of, okay, I get it, but what does that look like?
Yeah.
I think the definition and the shape of how I shaped that model was more with the mind, was more about change and transformation roles, from a junior stage all the way to leading change, and making change happen in an organization, or also as a consultant or as a thought leader. So it does apply to the roles for sure.
I would like to ask you about when you work with a client, let's just say a leadership client, what's your sort of at a high level, how would you go about assessing where they sit in that continuum?
That's a very good question. It's for me personally, I get the indication, and I'm saying that word deliberately, indication, because one conversation won't be enough, about where they are on that continuum, by understanding what's their view of what success looks like, understanding how they see transformation. What is transformation? What meaning do they give to working with people, working via people, through people? Understanding how they see that, their mindset, an indication of their mindset, gives that kind of clear indication of where they're at. Is it more about the doing? Is it more about the being? Is it more about past achievements? Is it about ticking the box? Is it about just get it done? Using certain words like change adoption, getting people to feel good about what they're doing, those kind of things would indicate where they are in that journey. And I wanted to also maybe comment on one of the points you've mentioned about we will never get to mastery. This is true and not true at the same time, in the sense that this is more of a continuum and a journey. The whole purpose is to be on the path. That's the goal.
Yeah.
Mastery is at one point in time. Mastery is a snapshot of where you are at the moment. Something major can happen in your life. Usually it's something a bit more dramatic, like someone's close death, health issues and stuff like that, which changes the way you see the world and your priorities in world, and kind of moves you without you knowing to that realm of orchestrator master. And then you start working on that, you make a decision, or maybe you don't have the capacity to do that. So it's kind of a snapshot of the where and now. You can be a master in that space 2 years ago, but now maybe you've pivoted, you've changed your role, or you moved from corporate role to working, you've got your own business, you want to start your own practice. You maybe need to drop down because, again, as we mentioned earlier about that beginner's mindset, you're not a master at that now because now your definition of value and success has changed. So you're dropping down a few levels in order to rebuild to the original level again.
What are some of the practical strategies that you've sort of tested that you definitely know will work with leaders to move them from A to B? Before we get into that, Jess, is it? I'm assuming, following the analogy of the martial arts, and I'm talking from personal experience. When I finished my yellow belt and brown belt, and green belt and then brown belt, it gets harder and harder because you were going deeper and deeper. Is that your observation around this continuum?
It is about going deeper for sure. It's about being or thinking more holistically in an integrated way. And it's about your mindset, the way you see things, the way you interpret things, the way you perceive things, the way you define what success looks like for you, for your team, and for the organization, what you're attached to. All of this come together.
From episode 73, In this episode, Professor Theo Farrell, Vice Chancellor at La Trobe University here in Australia, shares his perspective on navigating change in higher education. He highlights the importance of authentic engagement and co-design in driving sustainable change, explores the transformative impact of AI on universities, and addresses the challenges posed by legacy systems in traditional academic structures. His insights provide a compelling roadmap, fostering innovation in this unique and dynamic sector. So, how would you suggest some of the engagement strategies that people like me in the business of change to probably consider when we go into a higher education sector?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the first thing is, for people like yourself who are leading teams driving change, like core teams driving change, it's the first point is the extent to which the senior leadership is really driving change. I mean, it's going to be very hard to drive change as part of a team that's supposed to do it if at the level at the very top of the university you don't have senior leadership that's really fully committed to that change.
Yeah.
And look, it's really common in universities where at a mid-level there's some really great work being done, but the senior leadership isn't really advocating, pushing, supporting it, and then it's harder to get traction. And also, to what extent at the very top is there real clarity of vision? So do you have a real clear sense of the direction of change, not the specifics, but the direction of change and why it's important? So I think, that's something that we at La Trobe are thinking about as we think about AI and how we embrace AI and really drive AI right across our business and our community. So and we are beginning to develop that vision of where we want to go. And it's still emerging, but the more that you can get clarity of vision, what's the direction of change, even if you don't know what the end point looks like, why are you moving along that trajectory, and communicating that to the entire community, because that's the entry point. So then when a change team comes along and works with parts of the academic or non-academic community in the university, part of the university community understands why that change team has certainly arrived on the doorstep and said, let's start doing this and that. I think also, because we have creative workforces, the more we can do structured co-design, the better. And so co-design is really key because that's how you get buy-in and people are really invested. So it produces sustainable change because people can see their fingerprints and their contribution to the change that's going forward. I use the word structured, really, that's important for me because initially when you're trying to unleash change, you might have a period of time which is unstructured. You just want this messy excitement around change and you want to encourage people to embrace it. But before too long, you want to actually refine it along certain vectors where you're going to invest and drive change enterprise-wide. And so structured co-design, when you engage with communities on the ground, parts of the business, parts of the academic communities, and you work with teams and individuals around how you might change this particular area of the university or that area of the university, you do want it still to be structured, because at the end of the day, you want to end up with something that is coherent in terms of where you're trying to go. And the last I would say is around authentic engagement. And by that, I mean, just recognizing we don't have all the answers, we don't have all the ideas. We want to actually harness the creativity, the brilliance of our community. I mean, universities are stuffed full of brilliant people. And creative people. They're fabulous, fabulous organizations to work in because there's so much fascinating diversity and brilliance in universities. If you want to harness that, you have to be authentic. So it means rethinking what you might want to do because you get really compelling alternative ideas and feedback. So I think those ideas around clarity of vision, structured co-design, and authentic engagement, if you do those things, I think you're more likely to get stakeholder buy-in and produce sustainable change.
Theo, I'd like to shift gear and talk about AI and talk about this disruptive technology that is not new, but it's been on the rise very quickly recently. How do you see that technology disrupting the higher education sector?
Look, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because just over a couple of years ago, we had ChatGPT appear on the scene quite quickly. And within a couple of months, you had 100 million users, famously supposed to be the fastest adoption of a product in human history. But it really opened eyes to how generative AI was going to drive change right across our societies and economies. And I think we are looking at something which is on a scale of the Industrial Revolution. So when you look at the world before 1800 and the world after 1900, they're two different worlds. You had zero economic growth. It was, before 1800, very little change in people's lives. Their circumstances was largely defined by no change over your lifetime. After 1900, you had an acceleration in economic growth across the industrializing world, and change became the dominant narrative and experience of people's lives. So it's like an ontological change in human society that occurred over about 90 years, actually, in the 1800s. I think the AI revolution is going to be something similar. It's going to drive ontological change in our existence and how we experience the world, how we understand the world, how we organize our economies and our societies. It's going to be profound change, but it'll probably unfold quite quickly within 10 or 20 years, so much faster than the Industrial Revolution. And so when you get into the future of work, what that looks like, it's going to be very significant change. And there's various consultancies that have suggested the scale of change, 65, 70% of job roles being either displaced or profoundly changed in terms of what people do in those roles. I think the reality is we don't quite know. We don't quite know how much change there will be. We don't quite know how fast it will unfold, but we know it's going to be very large and very quick, actually. And so for higher education, that means change across everything we do. How we prepare our students. I mean, all universities are essentially focused on empowering students for their futures. What that actually means now is we have to get serious about how, by the time our students graduate, their work and their workplace and their futures will be profoundly different. And so we have to start moving quite quickly to change our curriculum, to embed AI in what we teach and how we teach. And I think the challenge we're going to face in the next few years is we're going to have students arriving using AI tools, expecting that their skills in AI will be increased by the university over their course of study. And we're currently not prepared to do that, actually. So that's a big challenge for us. The other is AI is already powering scientific discovery. So what happened with AlphaFold and how protein structures, DeepMind, were basically able to model, millions of protein structures and make that freely available, and that is just profoundly changed the bio innovation. Is a good example of how AI could unlock scientific discovery. And so as universities, we now need to develop the capabilities to take this work forward. And so I'm really looking forward, for instance, on Friday here at La Trobe, we're going to launch our new Centre for AI and Medical Innovation, which is being funded by the Victorian State Government. That is going to power biotechnology innovation here in Melbourne. So really exciting frontiers. And I guess the last area for universities is, we have large populations of students that are with us. We have responsibilities for their health and well-being. We have responsibilities to support them in their learning journey. Here at La Trobe, we've got about 30,000 students, for instance. That's a massive business challenge because it's incredibly hard to provide this level of support that we really want to provide to students at scale, although I think we do a pretty good job, actually. But AI opens up the opportunity to provide truly personalized 24/7 support, and in particular supporting students from equity backgrounds or students who might have particular health and well-being needs. We're going to be able to support those students at scale in a much more personalized way. So there's huge opportunities, but the challenge for universities is how we invest in those capabilities and how we drive that change across our organization to deliver those outcomes for our students and for our communities.
I'm keen to understand from your perspective, Theo, the university as an entity, how is that different from a normal business organization, as in organizations that run business for profit? How is that from a structure, from a culture, from where you sit? How do you see change being adopted in the higher education setting than in a dynamic environment like in a retail environment?
Yeah, I mean, that's really, I guess it's very important, actually, certainly from the point of view of how we look at our, the challenges we have in higher education and the lessons we might draw from the business world about how we might meet those challenges. The first thing I would point out is that, universities are very significant from most businesses because of the complexity of value creation. So for most businesses, value creation is primarily around providing a great service or product for your customers and then generation revenue from that. So it's pretty straightforward. But for universities, value creation is much more complex because of the multiple purposes and stakeholders of universities. So value creation is around enhancing life opportunities for people. Value creation is around creating, helping communities in terms of their development and it's around also advancing scientific knowledge and achieving benefit for society and for people from that knowledge. So it's a much more complex thing, value creation. And of course, it does involve revenue because we need revenue to drive our business. And that's partly explains why when you think about academia, which the university at the core of the universities is the academy, academia is essentially almost anti-business. So, in academia, people don't think of courses as products, although arguably that's what they are. They don't think of students as customers. And in fact, many academics would strongly push back at the idea of students as customers. They see students as engaged in a learning journey, and we work with students on that learning journey. I mean, absolutely, it's true partly, but it's also true that students are customers, and increasingly they see themselves as customers because they're paying quite a lot for the product that you provide, which are the courses. And there's data that clearly shows this. And so I think there's, as universities, it's behoven on us to actually look at the quote unquote customer experience and what we can learn from the discipline of CX or customer experience to improve our student experience. That's an idea that, many academics wouldn't necessarily agree with. And the last I would say is around our business model. Because as a sector, our business model has essentially remained unchanged in decades. When you look at the core of the business model, it's about delivering courses that will last for postgraduate 1 or 2 years, for undergraduate between 3 and 5 years. That basic, students are charged fees against those courses. Those courses are delivered by academics who have a lot of control over the content of those courses. They're delivered in classrooms. Students are provided with learning materials, and then there's assessment through essays and exams or practicals. That's remained unchanged for decades. You could go back 20 years and you'd find essentially the same suite of products, the same broad experience of how students consume those products and how we charge for them. And that the majority of our students would be students who leave school. That model has remained very unchanged, partly because it's heavily regulated by the state, and also it's quasi-funded. So the core of the funding is actually provided via the state. Even the amount you can charge is regulated by the state. And so because of all this regulation that's around it, and because also of the institution of the academy, which we can talk about later, but it's a very traditional institution. It goes back 1,000 years. It's actually very, very hard to disrupt. So there are a few noted examples, but broadly speaking, universities the world over, and certainly in the Western world, have largely remained unchanged for many, many decades, and arguably a century or so. And so that's quite interesting to come into that environment where we know broadly in our society, technology is driving so much change, such rapid change in services and products. And yet we are working in a sector that is quite resistant to change, actually, for all sorts of reasons.
What are some of the ideas that you've got already circling in your mind around maybe nudging that structure into the future?
It's interesting because it's around identifying where are the areas or what are the things that cause that resistance to change? And then how do you think about those things? And so the first is actually the nature of the academy. So the academy is built on disciplines. As much as for many, many years, universities have been trying to work on multidisciplinary research and research across disciplinary boundaries to identify innovative solutions to the challenges facing our societies. The reality is that most of the work that's conducted in universities is conducted within these disciplinary boundaries. So it could be, whatever it is, English, history, anthropology, psychology, or in the sciences, chemistry, biology, and so forth. Now, disciplines are very important because knowledge accumulates through those disciplines. And when you look at the development of scientific knowledge, it is an accumulative exercise that over time understandings develop about what is scientifically proven and what is open to scientific challenge. And that process is an accretive process over time. So disciplines and the tradition that come with them are actually important to the academic exercise. But it means that academics are very focused on their disciplines. And in essence, we have a workforce that is highly creative. It's a creative workforce. It's very important that that workforce, that academics feel empowered, because that's what's going to drive them in their work and support them in their work. But it also means that when you work with an academic community and you try and drive a program of change, it's a bit like herding cats. Right? So they all want to do it their own way and they go different directions. And that's, as I said, that's part of working with a fabulously diverse, creative community. But it means that driving change is difficult, actually. And another reason why, so because of all these silos within disciplines, but because also academics within those silos tend to do their own thing. And there are a few particular issues that are challenging. One is when you look at universities versus other organizations, the turnover of staff is very low. And when I was referring previously to the piece of work I did at King's on high performance culture, we looked at various sectors and we looked at really high performing organizations like Google and, you know, what were the major drivers of change? And in really high performing organizations, you tend to get, you get a core stable workforce, but you get quite a degree of change as well. And that's what brings new ideas and that drives high performance. So as I recall from memory, Google would typically turn over 10% of its workforce. This was back in the late 2000s. Academic workforces tend to be more stable. There tends to be lower turnover. So that means you don't have that change function that's driving it. But at the same time, it means you've got strong communities, which are really great. Regulation, external regulation is a real drag and change. And so you have to try and work that. And lastly, as you probably know, universities have all sorts of legacy systems, IT systems, as well as business processes, and they are major drags and change. And so, in fact, right now, as we're on the cusp of technology-powered change, it's occurring across our sector. For all universities, the large suite of legacy IT systems that we have, which will be horrendously complex and expensive to change, are a major drag on innovation. Although I was really struck talking to a business leader the other day that they said, you know, and this is someone in finance, and they said, don't think we have it that much better where we are. That in fact, even in finance, many organizations have legacy systems, and the cost and complexity of changing those systems is a significant challenge.
From episode 65, Susan Bartlett and Terry Block from Workomics unpack the change management flywheel, revealing how it drives sustainable transformation by overcoming resistance and building momentum. They discuss the role of leadership, the value of pilots and prototypes, and the need to align strategic changes with the employees' daily work. This episode is a must-listen for anyone tackling organizational change.
And over the course of that, we really established an organizational capability and a new way of working, which in my experience is a very difficult thing to do. Organizations are very set in their ways. But because we were leading with the value and with the results, people were so excited to come along. Like, can we do that too? Because I would like to get that great result that I saw my colleague get. And that's a very different mindset. And, you know, I can tell you that, you know, we've long since moved on from working with that organization. And I think all of the original people we worked with on that organizational capability have moved on as well. And yet the organizational capability is still there and being applied. And for me, that is perhaps, you know, like the greatest triumph as someone who makes their living in a consulting capacity, to have done work over a decade ago now and still have it be something that is being used, having shape-shifted and being adapted because, of course, the organizational context has shifted too. And I really credit the fact that while we did do a little bit of upfront, what's the strategy, what's the goal here, we much more quickly got down to let's make things, put them out in the world, and see how the customers react.
So then when you read about the flywheel, you were like, oh,
I'm like, yes, actually, that's what we did.
That's what we did, right?
Of course.
We tried something new, and the first few turns at that flywheel were really difficult and required a lot of stakeholdering and a lot of introducing people to new ways of working And the big pushes were there, but then once it got going, that flywheel, the momentum kept turning.
The shift in skepticism, right? The stakeholders who that first turned through were like, we can't do this. This is way too risky. We can't. They were the stakeholders who a year later would say things like, but wait a second, have you talked to the people who were doing that new thing? Because you should really be doing it their way. And that shift in a fairly short amount of time was, I think, unusual. And certainly when I compared it to some of my earlier experiences where the outputs were more theoretical and were more, here's a PowerPoint of how the world should be once we consultants leave, it seemed like the impact for the organization was so much more far-reaching and lasting.
What can get in the way of a flywheel? First of all, I like that with anything, I suppose, the start is difficult. And it's almost like creating a movement. But once you get going, you enlist more people, you've got more advocates, and before you know it, you've got a movement happening within an organization, which is a wonderful thing to observe. What can get in the way of a flywheel starting properly? Is it leadership? Is it purpose? Is it context? Or is it all of the above?
I think it can be all of the above. I think there's a couple of things that come to my mind immediately. One is from an on-the-ground employee perspective, the notion that you have to put strategic work into practical application as soon as possible is super important. People have to see how the change is going to live in their day-to-day. And they can't just see it in a PowerPoint presentation. They need to actually feel the change. How am I going to implement this change in my day-to-day work? And so one obstacle is that if we can't make that connection clear enough, the flywheel can stop working, because the flywheel depends on people doing the work and learning from it, iterating on it, trying it again, doing it better, sharing the learnings, getting more people involved. And so if that first link of how does it connect to my day-to-day isn't there, that can be really challenging. The other thing that comes to mind from a leadership perspective, which we have faced quite a few times in our consulting careers, is when the context changes. Often these initiatives that we're asked to do are asked for in contexts that are budget friendly, things are going well, yes. Everyone has time and breathing room to make space in their hearts and minds for this kind of work. And then budgets start, business doesn't do well potentially, or budgets start getting clawed back. And, I was recently at a conference where Patrick Enns, the president of Capital One Canada, was saying, often organizations can start thinking that's the strategy. The budget cutting is the strategy, yeah. Or the downsizing is the strategy. And it's really not. And even though those things are happening in the context, maintaining the commitment to the strategy that you created in the first place from leadership's perspective is super important. And I think one of those obstacles to the flywheel is getting distracted from your strategy, from the thing you're trying to do, by those broader context pieces.
I'm a big advocate of we need to be masters of change impact. Because everything you introduce, and I might be completely wrong, but I'm yet to be proven wrong with this one. I think all changes fail or because we could not really understand the first or second or third layer of impact. Am I close to accurate in here? Because when I dig deep into any failure, I discovered that somebody somewhere could not really understand the deeper impact of introducing this particular change. So, for example, the example that you just shared, somebody somewhere could not really go deeper into understand the impact of this new technology that will not offer you more than one option. Open to you.
I think
Have
that's
a comment.
Yeah, I mean, that tracks for me, I think. And that's a big part of the work that we do is, we prototype these things. We put it in front of people. We might have even prototyped that screen with a customer to see what the reaction would be. We take it 3 levels deeper so that we can get to those moments. And so, yes, I think that's right. If you're not spending the time to understand the impact of the decisions on the user experience and the employee experience downstream, you will miss something.
Yes.
Well, and I think more also that you will miss things regardless, right? The perfect solution has never been rolled out at day 1 or day 1,000. And so I think equally it's just a recognition that change is constant and that the system is never done, and we always have to be prepared to make a change when it's called upon, and not let the change fatigue build up and just be like, no, nobody can even think about touching that system yet again, just because we've uncovered yet another, blip in the matrix.
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you're talking about here, Susan, is that, yes, level 1 is kind of easy because these are the predictables. Level 2, it can be more complex, and then it gets even more complex at level 3. If we understand level 3, everything will be really good. But there are what we call the review times when you review the limitations of any change. I think time is a good factor later to really understand the level 2 and level 3 at a deeper level. But unfortunately, the majority of us in organizations, we run a project and then we leave it after that and we move on to the next one, which is not a criticism, but I think when in the proverbial, when we hand it over to the business as usual, which is never business as usual, but we hope that the management of this particular team will put their hat on as change managers themselves and understand that those levels of impact later, because we can't see them when we roll it out. Some of the impacts will come probably years after. And so that's the vigilance that we hope organizations will have. But both of you in your organization promote the pilot mindset. Does that help at the start? Is that what you're talking about, Terry, when you talk about the prototype?
Sure. I mean, I think for us, the notion that we prototype is just very much built into our ways of working. We don't take things to the finish line and then show them to our clients, because that doesn't set anyone up for success. And we also encourage our clients not to just put things in front of their customers and employees that they haven't been building along the way alongside their customers and employees. So certainly that's, prototyping is a way of working that is very dear to us. Susan, you've got some thoughts on the pilot mindset.
I think a place I wanted to go with it is I was reading something a few weeks ago about, the language inside consultancies or agencies or vendors of like, is it client ready? And if you work in a service provider, you probably use those words, 10 times a day. And I was thinking, oh gosh, I don't think we've ever used those words at Workomics. And I think the reason is because we truly believe that anything can be client ready as long as you've framed it appropriately. And so I want to share with you these 2 bullet points that I just scratched down on a whiteboard to see if they resonate. That can be client ready. But if you present it as, here's the result of all of this is the answer to your problem, then it won't be. And so I think when we talk about the pilot mindset, we are talking about just this being open to the goal is not fixed. Our understanding of the problem is not fixed. And the more often we can go back and forth and iterate, the quicker we're going to get to something that's practical and useful and again, we're back at the flywheel and creating momentum. I think when we use the term pilot, we're more often talking about containing risk from a particular decision versus momentum is a little bit more, or flywheel is a little bit more about building the momentum.
Mm-hmm.
From episode 60, Jason Little shares how AI is reshaping change management by enabling faster, smarter, and more impactful transformations. Drawing from his experience as the author From Skeptic to Strategist and founder of Lean Change, Jason discusses how AI helps cut through workplace overwhelm, shifts focus from repetitive tasks to actionable insights, and challenges traditional roles by automating processes. Your book is called From Skeptic to a Strategist, Embracing the AI in Change Management. Talk to me about this book. Why were you a skeptic?
Well, I wasn't a skeptic. It was what I was reading about how people in change were approaching AI.
Sure.
There was almost this, change management, it's a conservative profession, more or less. So people are going to sit and wait and plan and strategize. And with AI, that's almost it's never going to work because it moves too fast.
Yeah.
So I'd started writing a blog post about using it on some change projects. And the blog post just kept growing and growing. And I thought, well, this needs to be a book. So I sat down, and it was basically 22 straight hours of it just poured out into the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the key takeaway for you? Because I want to go deeper into this rabbit hole of how we as professionals and practitioners in a field that promotes adaptability, how we adopt new things. And also I can see three types of people and maybe that's related to how we look at change. There are those that get excited about it, and there are those that sit dormant and wait for things, and there are the skeptics, obviously. And there are those in between that oscillate between that. But these are I want to pick your brain on, is it a sense of fraud sometimes that we feel that when we use AI to actually help us in our work?
So it feels like cheating almost.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could see that. I could see that because, I've seen some posts that talk about how the more we get reliant on AI, the less likely we're going to think for ourselves, and humanity is going to become stupid. And you could make a case for that. But there's a really great book by Daniel Levitin, The Organized Mind. And he talks about when there's a huge technology shift, we go through this exact same thing. When TV was created, he goes back to when writing was created. So writing was originally created to track inventory. When villages would trade goods, they couldn't keep track of it anymore. They had to write something down to keep track of inventory and trades and things like that. And the perception back then was people are going to be stupid. If they're writing it down, they won't have to think about it and remember. Then when radio came out and TV and the internet, the same things happened again. Oh, we can just search Google. We don't have to know anything. We're going to be stupid. But he says it actually makes humans more intelligent because we invent technology so our brain can be freed up from repeatable, mundane things, and we can focus on higher order, more complex problems.
Yes.
And I think that's more the stance that I take with AI. Is it's, I wouldn't have to hire a team of 3 people anymore. I can do it myself.
Some of us do, and I see it in some of my colleagues. There's a sense of this is so overwhelming for me. And that overwhelmed feeling might create this inertia in me to say, well, this is not going to impact me now, and I don't need to worry about it until maybe perhaps the organization will train me and all of that. Have you noticed that at all?
Yeah, there's a lot of wait and see because it hundreds of articles come out a day.
Yes.
And when we talk about AI, when you look at the change management audience, AI equals ChatGPT.
Yes.
Much like, Kleenex is
Is a
the
tissue.
brand.
Yeah.
It's a tissue, but we call it Kleenex.
Yes.
So people just think AI is ChatGPT and that's it. But there is a billion other tools, language models, little widgets, automation tools that are tied up in that ecosystem. And it is all but impossible for anybody to stay up to date on all of that stuff. I think what is likely to happen is, we've all worked in organizations. They want change faster, better, and cheaper. AI is going to give them that capability, and they're going to bypass the change managers. They're going to force them into using this technology, or they'll start using it themselves. Like, they're not going to hire a consultant or an agile coach. They're going to be, there's an agile coaching bot I can ask questions to. I'm not going to hire somebody for $3,500 a day. I'm just going to pay the $20 a month for this bot, let all my company use it, and that's good enough.
Yeah. Let's just maybe double click on that. I think before the recording, we did talk about the human experience is always going to be there. And I just want to touch on that the way I see it. Is that one of the challenges for me? I wanted to do many things at the same time, and I didn't have the time. AI now can enable me to work on multiple projects because I don't need to spend a lot of time on doing the stuff that they are not insightful for me. I want to focus on the insight of the exercise. And organizations expect me to give them insights rather than plans. Because as you would know, the territory is not the map is not the territory. I can give you a map, but the territory is different when it comes to change management. Is that how you see it, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, I think it is different. And I think, the story I opened the book with is back in the day, in the 90s, when I worked on a web team inside of marketing. There were 5 of us on the team. I was the web designer. We had a programmer, graphic designer, intranet person, and a manager for one public website that changed maybe once a week, and an intranet site. And today, that job is done by a high school intern using WordPress and a bunch of other no-code and low-code tools.
Right.
So it's not like we all got fired because of technology. The next time an opportunity came up where we needed a certain type of skill, I can't just be a web designer anymore. Nobody hires web designers today. Yeah. You have to be multi-skilled. And I think the same thing is going to apply to change managers. But when you think of, I like that you touched on the insight part, because you don't necessarily need a quote unquote change manager or comms person to do that. You just need the data. So you can get, somebody who knows how to gather information and knows how to prompt and use AI to generate that stuff. You need those skills, not so much the title anymore, is my working hypothesis. Now, obviously, that's going to be different in large organizations. You go into enterprises that are running 3-year transformation programs and large software rollouts, you're going to need a bigger change team. But I think more companies are going to look for people who can help them make sense of their changes by using AI, as opposed to we have to hire a change manager for that.
You make me think about this now in a slightly different way whilst you're talking. My train of thought, I've been working on a number of projects related to students and the use of AI. And one of the conclusions that I had with quite a few guests in my podcast, especially in the higher education, is that, so the notion is that because of AI, instead of resisting it and worrying that there's going to be a loss of cheating to students, from students, we should elevate the standards and that we expect from learning now, because we've got this tool. If I go on through the same wavelength of thinking that you're talking about here, it may mean now that, actually highly likely, it will be that our clients will expect a richer change experience because we've got the tools, we've got everything, And the reason why I also talk about insight is the machine can give you a lot of data. The smartness comes into how you synthesize the data and put it as an insight, actionable insight for the client. Am I on the right track here?
Yeah, because the good thing is you can do that in real time with AI.
Sure.
So it's not like we have to prepare it and send it to the people making decisions. We're in the room or we're on Zoom with whatever AI we want to use, and we're feeding it the data and asking it questions in real time. So you have a driver who's driving that process. So, for example, I did this with a company I did some training for a few weeks ago. We had a mural board with, I don't know, a couple hundred sticky notes on it of insights from their retrospective and problems they're having with Agile and stuff like that. I took a screenshot, I dumped it into AI, and we started asking it questions.
Yes.
Look for patterns, find this, what about that? Now, we still had to have the conversation internally, and there was some safety in me being the quote unquote Agile coach expert, helping them through that process. But there's no reason why they couldn't have done this on their own.
Of course. Yes. Yeah.
So it's the emphasis is how do we solve problems in a creative way? Because the knowledge part is crazy easy. Like obviously you see this in universities, right? Like knowledge is easier to acquire. Problem solving skills becomes the challenge.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Anybody can regurgitate facts. Everybody's got, all the knowledge in the world available at their fingertips. It's how we use it, apply it, how we solve problems, how we help people make sense of problems so they can make decisions faster with better data.
From episode 64, Sarah Kaur discusses building trust in AI through transparency and alignment with the values, AI's role in transforming workplace change, and its potential as a collaborative thinking partner. She highlights the importance of clear policies, safe innovation, and balancing AI's capabilities with the human expertise and wisdom. Holistically, from where you sit, what do we need to look at when we want to build the trust in the algorithms, the way you design it? So then we have trust in the outcome. We started thinking about it, and I think this will be a revolutionary step. And maybe this is the way to create that unbiased equity if we do it right.
There's so much in what you just said, but
yes,
maybe
I know. This is I'm talking like an ignorant person, so all of these things are coming into my mind. But so we hear a lot about responsible AI, auditable AI, ethical AI. I suppose they may mean slightly differently, but the intention is the same. How do I trust the output of this of this technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to expand on why it's so critical to have trust. I think there's been multiple surveys done in Australia by firms like McKinsey, but also really targeted research by University of Queensland that looks at the attitudes of the general public and their trust in companies' use of AI. And what we're seeing is that Australia, generally is considered a bit of a laggard when it comes to technology adoption. And specifically when it comes to AI, we're starting to see that we could have so much amazing productivity growth. We could really start to, drive forward innovation and the market share that we have. But what's holding us back is that about only 40%, I think, of people surveyed say, yep, we trust companies to use AI for our benefit or for good, or in a way that we can actually understand it. So there's a huge skepticism. And I think if you think about the very complex landscape of what does responsible or ethical or safe use of AI, we start to see that companies, CEOs, board directors, they're so accountable for the use of these technologies, but they may not be clear yet about the interaction of how AI either enhances opportunities or enhances their risk profile. In a lot of frameworks around safe and responsible AI, we start to see people saying, look, first of all, consumer law, privacy law, any business is already going to be subject to lots of legal and regulatory compliance obligations. So your first step is to make sure that however you're using AI, it's not in conflict, I suppose, or you're not exposing to risks that you're not comfortable taking according to your existing obligations. And then I think there's a second level where we think and talk about not just do no harm. So don't allow data to be accessed when it shouldn't, but it's actually around values alignment. In 2019, the Department of Industry and Data 61 did a very wide-scale public consultation, came up with 8 Australian AI ethics principles, and they're generally aligned with, I guess, international AI principles and human rights being expressed. But I think they're just one input, right? Every organization will need to look at those principles and then figure out how does that interact with my company mission, my purpose, my values, how I implement those with my use of AI, with my employees. That's actually a really, I think, like quite a fertile ground for education around AI ethics and company values and how you want to express them. So that's, I think, the second order. And the third order, which I know is very close to your heart, is so what? Like, so what if you're complying with the law? So what if all your values are aligned? What is the impact it's having on your external world? So are your consumers benefiting? In the case of Amica, what the business case was basically, let's take a $10,000 case and reduce the cost to make it more accessible. And couples can now generate that from $150 to $500. So that's a very clear case of external impact and access for a purpose. So if any company can kind of go through the steps from obligation and doing no harm to values alignment to then saying we really care and we want to get signals back from outside on how our use of AI is creating impact. I think those kind of 3 pillars are going to be really increasingly important to demonstrate that you are trustworthy.
I often describe it that the information is right, but it's not the truth.
That's a great saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So the truth, I only know the truth. Well, I know part of the truth anyway, but that comes from years of experience. And sometimes as humans, we really just need a start, and AI can give us that particular start. If AI is going to augment my work, what do you think people in the workplace would need to start thinking about? So one of the things that I heard recently is that we need to start thinking that I am working with AI and not with computers anymore. Is that the new way of working that will evolve at some stage?
It's really, I've been thinking about that, like your metaphors for AI, like our use of laptops is really ubiquitous. It wasn't always. It hasn't actually taken away more jobs than it's created, let's say. Mm-hmm. Or even thinking about a metaphor like AI as electricity. It used to be dangerous and crazy, but over time it's evolved to have so many applications, universal standards, safety. Like it's become a commodity that we all use and trust.
Yeah.
And no doubt that AI is going to happen or have a similar trajectory. But I think there's have you heard of Carol Sanford? She's a US-based kind of, she talks a lot about regenerative businesses and kind of creating a culture where everyone in an organization understands the vision, but they also understand when they are stepping outside of what they should be doing. And because they know the vision where they should be going, and they know very clearly if I step outside this line, I will get in some serious consequential trouble. They also understand the zone of relative autonomous freedom where they can do their jobs to the best of their ability. And I think it's really important for organizations to start being quite clear about their expectations of the use of AI. So having a fair use of AI policy that's internal and very clear starts to give employees the signals they need to say, look, I might in my job, because I'm a frontline worker, I know that my job could be greatly enhanced by, I don't know, like having an email template for this or that Gen AI could use. I know that I would be stepping well outside the bounds of expected norms if I put in my customer data into ChatGPT. But I need to know from the organization, do you have plans to have an internal kind of facing tool for me to do this? Because otherwise, what we are already seeing is the concept of shadow Gen AI tools, where I think there was a recent survey around the world, like at least 20% of employees admit to using un-IT approved Gen AI tools as part of their workflow.
Yes.
That's a huge opportunity because people are already, like, you're not having to pilot something and do a huge change management thing. You're actually just needing to create the space for employees to say, well, I'm already doing this. Can we do this so it's safe? Like, can I tell you about it without getting in trouble? Because innovation's probably already everywhere and maybe you're just not harnessing it. And so I really believe that it's a huge shift that employers can do a lot to harness.
I'm going to look up that person. What was their name again?
Carol Sanford.
Excellent. I'll look up that name again because I'm really interested in it now. A couple of things. You did mention about the survey around Australians don't have a lot of trust in there. I think that's because of our nature. We are cynical most of the time, and it is going to take a lot of time. This will pose a challenge when it comes to change adoption in the workplace, which means that we need to allow a little bit of longer runway for Australia to adopt. But once we adopt it, we are cool with it. The other thing that you mentioned is, which is really an interesting topic that I've spent a lot of time over the last 3 weeks in particular, which is exactly what you just mentioned. I actually analyzed the way open source AI, the mother company, and Microsoft and even Google, how they manage their change adoption for their technology. So they give it to you, you play with it, and then they augment it with other bits and pieces. You were right. So one of the things that I started thinking about working with my clients is that unlike the normal change, which is we're going to communicate that to you, we're going to train you on it, then we give you access. This particular one, as you mentioned, I'm aware of that survey. In fact, about 65% of people lie when they say we don't use it, they still use it. Which is, there's a stigma around the cheating part of it, but that will go away very quickly because if you think about it, Excel works out formulas for us. That's not cheating. I'm not going to work it out myself. So what I'm doing now is that we give access. We allow them a good period of time to play with that, and then we come and bridge the gap with the training, and then we sustain it and reinforce it later.
I think I'd say a piece of advice or maybe an insight that I heard you touch on in your story about your own interactions with ChatGPT. I think that what we have access to now is an incredibly powerful technology that is able to aggregate basically the internet and synthesize it for us. And that's such an amazing, potentially democratizing, powerful force where every one of us, there is still a digital divide. It's not completely accessible, but a great number of us are now able to get generic advice tailored to our situation that is roughly equivalent to what, like you said, we would have had to pay a specialist a good deal of money for. But that's not the end of the insight. I think the interaction style, so me, a human, talking to a machine on my computer, I actually have a lot less inhibitions about the way I will ask for feedback. Like you were saying, can you help me critique my questions? I might not be brave enough to do that with a human expert. I might not want to seem vulnerable, or I might not want to waste their time. But what we have in technologies like this now is almost the endless ability to have a back and forth where we don't feel like we're under a spotlight or judged, like we have a thinking partner. Or if you're creating an image, you can kind of go, like, it doesn't get tired. It doesn't get sick of you saying, oh, stop telling me to make it, more green or whatever.
Yes.
It's actually a very patient and powerful technology. So if we understand its limitations, if we understand that whatever it gives us is an input to the thing that we want to make, I think that's a huge framing about empowering people to use technology and be able to do that productively and within a safe kind of environment where they are confident too.
From episode 67, Paola Anastasiada explores the critical role of leadership in driving change, addressing the challenges of siloed work, and the importance of cohesive strategies. She highlights the need for proper education and alignment of people, processes, and technology in today's fast-changing world. Organizational change management, in a nutshell, can you simplify that to us?
I can, except I need a small disclaimer. This is not necessarily an original explanation. I heard it somewhere, and I think it's really good. So when we prepare for change, that involves developing a solution. And I'm calling it generically a solution because it can be anything. It can be technology, it can be processes, it can be restructuring, anything else. And this solution has to be prepared for the organization. And organizational change management is about preparing the organization for the solution. This is how I would summarize it.
Yeah. Let's talk about the role of leadership in the organizational change management. What's their role in today's world? Your definition talks about it in an idealistic sense. How can we make that in a practical way? And what's the role of the leadership in ensuring that the organization has a robust organizational change management? Are we talking here about having a framework, or are we talking here about having guiding principles when it comes to change?
I think it's a little bit of both. And when I think about leadership, I think about two levels. First and foremost, executive leaders, who often play the role of change sponsors, a role that they are hardly prepared to play because there is a lack of change management presence in the business education system overall, even within the world's top 100 business schools, as I've come to discover in my recent research. And then the other level that I'm thinking of is the mid-level leadership, middle managers, if you will, who are often neglected, but who have a very important role to play in leading change. If I go back to the first category, executive leaders, and what it means to be a change sponsor, first and foremost, it has to do with understanding what change management is and why it's important. Then leaders need to understand what the roles are, what people are involved in making change happen, and particularly what their role is. There is research over the past more than 25 years that shows that primary sponsors, as we usually call them, meaning usually executive leaders in important change initiatives, are the most important factor in the success or the failure of change. And so that is reason enough for them to want to pay attention to what it means to lead change and obviously to do it. When it comes to the second group I referred to, mid-level managers or frontline managers, how they are usually called, have a very important role in leading their teams through change, but in different ways that we can elaborate on. But the idea is that both the leaders, both the executive leaders as change sponsors and frontline managers are absolutely indispensable to successful changes. And they both need to understand what their specific role is, what it takes to fulfill that role. And obviously, we need education for that.
Let's talk about that education piece. What does it look like? What you just mentioned is great. But the reality is that the majority of organizations, they somehow work in silos. And that poses a huge challenge to driving one overarching organizational change experience, let's just call it that. He did talk about the executive level. I want to touch on the middle management because I think that's a very critical slice in the pie. And they are the enablers. I see them as the people that can make or break a change. So I know that I talked about a couple of things, but let's just talk about what's your view when you see organizations work in silos and one business function deals with change differently from the other, and yet we look at the organization as one unit?
Siloed work is a systemic issue, and for systemic issues, we need systemic solutions. For me, it all starts from the executive leader's ability to grasp the importance of working in a cohesive manner. And in theory, all leaders have that understanding. But in practice, it's a different story. So that is why I think leaders must have an education in change management. They must be exposed to the foundations of change management and integrate those key principles into their practice. Whether or not they realize it, leaders are always in the limelight. And certain primary sponsors don't see the need for their continued exposure to people. In other words, a lot of primary sponsors from the executive ranks think that sponsorship means a generous pocket and an authoritative title that opens doors. And it's much more than that. And until leaders or more leaders at the executive level understand their particular role and the need to become involved and active with a change from the beginning until the end, we will not see siloed work disappear. Because it's the leaders who set the vision and who set an example and who create the rules of the game. This is my view on siloed work in a nutshell.
When we see leaders, then the feeling we get that we are supported, there's going to be less uncertainty happening in there, and that there's a huge belief from the leadership, and therefore I gotta have to look at this particular change. When you talk about, some people call it educating the leadership group, or they need to be educated. Sometimes, Paula, it doesn't mean that they need to go and join a course. Sometimes it can be as simple as their change manager can sit them for half an hour or an hour and actually explain their role to them. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. Mm-hmm. I think that half an hour is too little time to walk leaders through everything they need to know. I think that for someone in an executive leadership role who has had no exposure to change management, it's very important to sit down, whether it be in the context of a course or a workshop or a private session, and absorb the foundational information about, for example, what is change management? Why is it important for your organization? Why do you need it and when? What happens if you don't have it? Then talk about the roles. Who does what in change management? And what is your particular role as a leader? How do your other leaders come into play? How do frontline managers come into play? What does the change manager do? What can you expect from them? What does a project manager do? What is the working model for these key roles? How do you build a good strategy to drive change? How do you, first of all, plan or build a vision around change? A lot of important topics, and I doubt that if we just jump to the tactics, we can solve the issue. I'm a strong believer that understanding and education, or understanding through education and experience, but first of all, education, is the key to a lot of the issues we see in organizations of all sizes and in all sorts of industries.
I want to shift gear, and I'm aware of time, and we are coming close to the end of the podcast. I'm thoroughly enjoying this. You made me think about a couple of things that I really need to consider in my practice. And I want to be more articulate about what is my value as an external person to an organization. So we both talked about that. I've got a feeling that the topic of organizational change management before COVID was important, and now it's probably even more important, considering organizations now face the AI technology coming their way, new ways of working, the hybrid, the technological advancement, the cultural transformation, the diversity and inclusivity. The staff expectations are different now. Am I right in thinking that more than ever that we need to pay attention to this now?
I think so. And I would add to what you mentioned, the topic of digital transformation, which is very much in fashion these days. And actually, business schools around the world have caught on to the importance of digital transformation, except unfortunately, they don't fully understand it. And they just treat digital transformation as something that has to do purely with technology, when in fact, it has a lot to do with people and processes in addition to technology.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about AI. We talk a lot about things like ERP and cloud and machine learning and so on and so forth, without understanding, at least in these academic environments, that you cannot decouple technology from people and processes.
Yeah.
And so I think that in this day and age where a lot of senior leaders attend executive courses, executive education programs, whether it be in business schools or via leadership development programs offered within their companies or outside, they need to understand what's at stake in digital transformation. And yes, all the other things you've mentioned are very important, for example, DEI, but I see a lot of disproportionate interest in adopting AI and other technologies, because that is where leaders really see competitive advantage. But that competitive advantage cannot be obtained unless we pay attention to people and processes and incorporate change management as a robust practice, building our capability from the ground up, if needed, in order to face up to that challenge.
Well, technology for me is an enabler to build capability. So that's why I think your point around you can have the best technology, and if it's detached from the human aspect of it, it will be a useless exercise, and then
Yes.
you create more frustration and all of that. So I think the majority of the businesses out there understand it, they believe in it, but I'm not too sure if the application of it is really solid. If you talk to a leader, they will be saying to you, yeah, we think it's important. But in reality, how do you make that important as a practice within an organization? That's really what differentiates those people who talk about it and those people who understand it deeply and pay attention to it. In fact,
it's true.
Yeah.
It's true, except there are leaders who do take it seriously. And as a measure of that, they attend, like I said, executive education courses offered by the world's top business schools.
Yeah.
And they get out of those courses thinking that they know everything there is to know about digital transformation, when in fact they don't. They barely scratch the surface, because in my research, it looks like most of these courses on digital transformation simply deal with the technology. They merely provide an introduction to what types of technology are out there and what senior executives could consider integrating into their own organizations. That's it. That's where it stops.
Yeah.
In some cases, they also talk about a so-called digital strategy. But again, that is very, very superficial, in my opinion.
Will we see a rise of the chief change officer?
There are organizations where this role already exists, and I salute that, because it's a recognition of the importance of dealing with change and transformation in an appropriate way. There are other organizations where we also have the Chief Transformation Office as well, and the Chief Transformation Officer. What's important is for change management to have a seat at the table. The designation, in other words, the title of the person taking this message to the executive table, matters less to me than their mandate and their determination.
From episode 62, Alex Bodak shares transformative insights on leading impactful change. He introduces the impact equation, emphasizing the role of mindset, leadership, and action, and explores meaningful ways to measure impact, avoiding vanity metrics. Alex also defines leadership as change-making, showing how anyone can create meaningful impact, a must-listen for aspiring change-makers. The word maker in the title implies also that you'll have to take action to get change done. And I think you mentioned also, I'm trying to remember the equation, but I might get this wrong, but let me have a go. I think you mentioned there's an impact equation, and I think you talked about mindset divided by leadership multiplied by action equals impact.
Yeah, very, very close. So I can just take it forward. And I think this is a crucial idea. It's impacted a lot of my students, so much so that one of my students actually got this impact equation tattooed on himself. And so I don't think you have to go that far, perhaps, but it's a nice way of thinking about the way you leave your mark in the world.
Yes.
So what I say, your impact as a change maker is equal to the sum of your mindset and your leadership. So the mindset is really how you see the world. Your changemaker leadership is how you engage with the world. So that put that in parentheses, and then you multiply that by your changemaker action. Now, it doesn't take a brilliant mathematician to know that any number that you multiply by zero is zero. Yes. It doesn't matter if you multiply 1,000,000 by zero, it's still zero. And that's a way of us remembering and calling into a focal point this idea that it's not enough to just have a mindset, not enough to just have leadership. That change makers have to take an action. It doesn't mean that it's easy. It can be really challenging. We can talk a bit about how you kind of overcome the inertia. But every change maker, if you want to have any impact in the world, you've got to start taking action.
So without action, nothing happens, obviously. How would you measure that impact, though, Alex?
Well, look, in the social entrepreneurship world, everyone's talking about impact measurement, and I don't think anyone gets it quite right.
Sure.
I'll share a couple of ideas that I think are helpful. So the first, based on sort of bad habits I've seen in the world. Sometimes people like to measure 100 different things, and then they cherry pick the 2 or 3 metrics that make them look the best. That's obviously a mistake. And so I think up front, you need to do some thinking about what are the most important metrics, the 1, 2, or 3 things that tell me, yes, I'm absolutely having an impact. The second is we need to stay away from vanity metrics. That comes from the lean startup world, but it's this idea of metrics that make us feel good or maybe look good on the outside, but aren't actually that meaningful. And so that might be number of followers on Instagram. That could feel really good, but just having followers on Instagram doesn't actually mean you have any impact. That's just a number that makes you feel like you're popular. The third thing I'd suggest is to not forget about the qualitative. We tend to obsess on the quantitative, but I think there's also a role for the quantitative. I was living in Stockholm, Sweden, and running an incubator for change makers, where we would give them basically the salary funding they needed to quit whatever they're doing, focus full time on their idea. And we would ask them to measure their impact. We would ask them not just for the quantitative measures, but also the qualitative. Tell us the story of the work you've done and how that's changed or influenced folks. And then the fourth idea is to root it in something called the theory of change. So if you're a very logical person, this works well for you. It's also sometimes referred to as a logic model. But the idea is you actually start with the vision in mind. So 10, 20 years from now, if things go perfectly, what's that vision? What's the ideal state that you want to be at? Then you work back of it and say, okay, for that to be true, what would have to be true 5 years from now? Okay, for that to be true, what would have to be true 1 year from now? And then you think about what are the metrics, the things that would tell me that I'm on the right path towards that. So I don't have any direct answers there because, again, I think it's a field that we're all trying to figure out as we go. But that's how I would suggest that you at least start thinking about it. So fewer rather than more. Be aware of vanity metrics, include qualitative, and then anchor it in a theory of change and some logic.
It sounds like you're talking about the inner game of change. The rules of the inner game of change is that know where you went ahead and then start backward with the small steps and make them actionable. Again, you're going back to the idea of taking action, which is really important. You did talk about the vanity measures. It is hard not to have vanity measures. Is your suggestion that they might pop up, but then you'll have to go beyond them?
Yeah. So when I ran the incubator, we'd have folks who would say, look how impactful my program is. We've got 1,000 Instagram followers. We've got 10,000 Instagram followers. And it feels good. It's nice to have that. But that in of itself doesn't actually mean anything. If you want to think about social media engagement, look at how many folks are sharing your posts, are engaging with your posts, are giving it to someone else. What's the growth? Those types of things. But it's so easy to just fall into the things that make us feel good or look good. Another way to think about this as we think about sort of the process of becoming a change maker is where are you looking for your locus of control? Are you focused externally or are you focused more internally? Are you focused on things, having a process, doing things in the right way? Or are you focused on maybe cutting some corners, but as long as you can get to that end result, whatever it is, then you feel good about it. I think that when it comes to meaningful metrics, you want to be focused on things that are a little bit more on the intrinsic side rather than the extrinsic side.
I must admit, and I think I shared my story with you before we started recording about the podcast, I did start looking at the downloads early in the stage, only to realize that I got hit with a question, so what? And I realized later, first of all, I no longer look at them. Maybe every few months, sometimes a guest asks me about them. But I think my metric for success, which is the impact I make on my audience. So if I get a piece of feedback or somebody saying, I listened to your podcast, and I'm thinking, why would you listen to my podcast? You're actually a plumber, believe it or not, or a nurse. I just feel that, okay, well, I influence somebody. And if I raise the question in somebody's head or maybe fine-tune something, that will be fantastic for me. So that will be the measure of my success going forward. So yes, I did have the vanity measure, but I think I moved on very quickly. In the workplace and in organizations, we do manage change. So everything, that happens in an organization is actually a change. In fact, I've thought about this for a while, and I always thought that a leader is actually a change maker by default. And the way I see it is that a leader's job is to come everywhere to work to help their people succeed. And how they do that, they make decisions. Those decisions become changes. And therefore, by default, a leader is actually a change maker. And so it's in their best interest to understand how humans adopt change in the first place. What's your observation in organizations about how they manage change?
Well, I'll share in alignment with the way you think about this. So my favorite question when I do keynotes around the world is to ask the question, to start off the conversation and say, if the word leader didn't exist in dictionary, what word would you use instead? And it's fascinating to hear what people's responses are. It's facilitator, coach, guide, mentor, dictator sometimes. But I make the case that it's a change maker. I think that's the best synonym for as we think about what it takes to lead today. And I think it's an important shift too, because the word leader itself is quite loaded. I think there's some bias around race and class and gender and sort of who sees themselves as a leader. Based on a small sample size just of my class, I found that, for instance, many of the women in my class feel more comfortable with the title of change maker than of leader, again, because of sort of built-in cultural biases around who can be a leader, what a leader leader looks like. And so changemaker is a more inclusive way to think about that. And so I love this idea of shifting our identity to think about how can we be change makers. Part of what I don't like about the word leader, even if I'm a professor of leadership, is that we often think in terms of scarcity. We think that, okay, there's only one CEO in my organization. There's only 5 vice presidents, only 1 executive director. And that makes us feel like being a leader is scarce. And yeah, maybe titles of leadership is scarce. There's only one formal leader. But leadership as an act is actually abundant. Leadership is something that each of us, no matter where we are in the organization, can practice. Leadership itself doesn't require a title, doesn't require authority. And so I love helping people make that shift from thinking about sort of leader as a title, or I'll lead once I'm a vice president, I'll lead once someone tells me I could lead, to instead building that identity as a change maker. And once you have that, it reduces some of those barriers to doing leader-like acts and helping us show up in the best way, both for ourselves and for our teams and our organization.
Hi there, and thank you for listening. As we wrap up 2024, I want to thank you for being part of the Inner Game of Change community. Your support and engagement have made every episode truly meaningful. Wishing you and your loved ones a happy, safe, and restful holiday. I can't wait to kick off 2025 with another amazing lineup of guests, creative conversations, and transformative ideas. Until next year, stay well, stay curious, and approach every change with courage and curiosity. I am Ali Juma, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast.